Do you remember these? They used to get video from these, but they're not as popular as they used to be. And that's because we're consuming media differently, by using things like these, and these. And do you know what these require? Data, and a lot of it. Most of that data comes from underground cables, but half of the planet doesn't have access to cables that provide that reliable broadband. And that is why satellites could be a game changer, according to Tom Sullivan at the Federal Communications Commission.
We've all become accustomed to having broadband, and we see how instrumental it is in our daily lives, from education to healthcare, financial planning, and in areas in the US and globally, there just isn't the terrestrial case for that type of capacity, and that's where some of the satellite companies have provided those offerings.
Those offerings come from three kinds of satellites. The first, high-orbit satellites. They hover over the Earth's equator around 36,000 kilometers, are physically big, like the size of a school bus, and cost big bucks to make. Second are low Earth orbit satellites. They're only a tenth of the size of high-orbit sats, cheaper to build, and orbit at around only 1,000 kilometers. And then there are satellites that orbit even closer to Earth. They're known as cube satellites. They're about the size of a milk jug. Those orbit at only around 500 kilometers and can be attached together like Legos to multiply their power. Each of these satellites could eventually compete against the underground cables that get you your Verizon, Charter, or Comcast Wi-Fi. The high-orbit satellites cast a really wide net of data, nearly the size of North America wide. But because they're high up, they have less data capacity. This means they're not great for commercial uses like gaming because they have lag time. But low orbit and CubeSats are closer, so they can provide faster speed like 5G with lower latency. And that is what competes with cables back on planet Earth. The catch is that they have a narrower signal beam that covers less ground. And when you have smaller beams but still want a lot of coverage, you need a lot of satellites. So even though the price of the low orbit and CubeSats might be cheaper, the fact that you have to launch a lot of them still makes the whole prospect a pricey one. But they're still attracting some big commercial dollars. With newer satellites, companies can provide internet where current broadband cable infrastructure can't reach, and they can do it faster. This is data by the FCC tracking the speeds of data providers based on what they're advertising. That is cable and fiber, and that is satellite speed. When it comes to the satellite industry, there are names you know, like SpaceX and Amazon, and names you may not know, like OneWeb and Viasat, but they all have plans to launch entire fleets of satellites to get you your internet. And that's a gamble.
So for geostationary satellites, they've been licensed on what we call a first-come, first-served basis. Whoever applies for an orbital location has the first-mover advantage of getting into that orbit and using the spectrum and providing service.
That first-mover advantage is a big deal for any companies trying to sell you data. In fact, it helps to explain the increasing investment in small satellites. When you consider the cost for launching satellites is getting cheaper and cheaper for commercial companies, and the cost of smaller satellites is also getting cheaper and cheaper, it makes sense for companies to apply for satellite space as soon as possible. And those ever-cheapening costs are the result of one interesting new trend. Instead of 3 different companies building satellites, launching satellites, or using satellites, newer companies are trying to consolidate launching satellites and building satellites on their own, like SpaceX and Viasat. And that means more applications for satellites coming in faster than ever before, which comes with its own growing list of concerns.
Generally, companies are concerned because they're sharing similar orbital altitudes that they might receive a conflicting signal and might cause interference. Those are one of the areas where the FCC has asked the satellite community to, in other words, coordinate among themselves and demonstrate that they can share the spectrum. No one can tell how the industry and technology will continue to drive things forward on the satellite side or even the terrestrial side. What we've done at the FCC is tried to make the rules of the road conducive to help foster satellite innovation and technology in the United States.
If you live in a big city, most of your data will likely still come from underground cables. But if you like fast internet in places you couldn't get it before, satellites are going to increase competition to satisfy our ever-growing hunger for data.